morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the High Dragon's Breath Bow Wow, welcoming you back to another episode of Archon's Alternatives. Today we're talking about Halo Small Arms for the humans, for the UNSC, doing a general overview of human weapons from Halo. So let's get right into it with melee weapons, pistols, and submachine guns. So there's a couple interesting melee weapons in Halo that are kind of background weapons in many cases, and in some cases they're downright set pieces, and they are combat blades. Now, the most classic one, I think the one that we all saw in Reach, was the Kukri. The fact that there is a designate Kukri in the future with a forward slitted curved blade, that handheld battle axe that we all love, is wild. And of course, it would be for Spartans, those monstrous creatures that we rely upon to, hack off the limbs of much more large and dangerous things, or, oppress the population, because that's the point of them. So, that's the really big one here. The next one is the Mark I Bowie, the Mark 11 Tactical, and the Pattern 2 Composite. Now, the Mark I Bowie is a standard combat blade. You compare it to any Bowie knife in the modern day, and you'll be pretty much on the mark. But the Mark 11 Tactical is actually pretty interesting. I think this one was introduced in Halo 4, at least for John 117, and this sported two very interesting things. Unlike a lot of UNSC weaponry and equipment, it has a heavily contoured grip. And in addition to that, you can actually see that the blade on this is massive. It's incredibly thick, even in comparison to something like a machete, and it has a thumb grip and a thumb kind of half ring here that has a quillin pointing forward. Now, it is a one-sided blade, much like the Bowie, but it has something interesting as well. The Mark 11 Tactical has a squared off, almost like bird beak shaped tip. Now, this makes it relatively inefficient for stabbing, but the reason that you have a tip like this, there are several reasons why you'd have a tip like this. The first one is so that you can reverse the grip and use it to impale a target. The geometry of that tip is designed for a downward strike through a very tough material, and unlike the Bowie, which has kind of a curved hooked blade clearly designed for cutting, you can see that the Mark 11 is clearly designed for penetration, which is very much in need by the era of Halo 4, because we've come around to the era of everybody's got body armor up to the level of elites. So having the Mark 11 around, especially for a Spartan who's going to be doing a lot of stealth kills, would be very logical, and it is a relatively large knife, but nothing compared to the Pattern 2 Composite Sword. It's pretty much a big machete. But the interesting thing about the Mark II and the fact that it's a composite, it is a laminated steel blade. Now, laminated steel is usually not a good thing to make a blade out of, mostly because it tends to fall apart with whatever binding agent you're using. However, the Mark II has a specific design. Much like the mono-bladed weapons of 40K, the Mark II is designed to self-sharpen, aka each of the laminated layers is its own separate set of blades. Simply offset a little bit to the original, so that if there is damage, glinting, shattering of the blade, or separation of the composite parts of the weapon, it will still be effective. Now, the general use case for the Mark II composite sword is, of course, to be used as a machete, to cut down growth and things in your way. But of course, if those things in your way happen to be ungoy, then go right ahead. The next one up is a pistol, the M6 series, the Magnum, the most classic. Now, there are three versions of the Magnum, to my estimation. There's the smaller versions that we see in things like ODST, and we see in the hands of various people. We also see it a little bit in Halo 4, but those are essentially firing 44 short. It's a very blunt, flat, low-velocity round, and it really doesn't pack the punch of those later pistols. Halo 3 Magnum is also of a similar type. Now, again, that's not accurate in terms of the lore, but that is accurate in terms of how it works in-game. It clearly has a lot less stopping power than the much more traditional the M6D series of Magnum from Halo Combat Evolved. Now, the bigger versions of the Magnum are either using 50 short or 50 AE. I think it's more reasonable to say that the M6D is using 50 AE or 50 Action Express, and the 50 short is going to be used in more of the personal defense weapons. You know, the ones that we might see other captains in the UNSC using, but the 50 AE one is going to be the much larger, clapped out, or specialized version of the pistol designed to be a specialist combat weapon, maybe something that a captain would have like keys. Now, the SA series of PWSs are pretty unique, honestly. They take that kind of similar architecture, but they use 10mm rounds instead of the 44 short or the 50 caliber rounds that we have for the Magnums, and it just brings it down a little bit, 2mm, or a little bit less than 2mm, or a little bit more than 2mm, depending on the size of the round. These are special ops pistols generally, but with the designation as personal defense weapon, you could also see Oni Spooks or members of the UNSC Navy possibly using the SA series. And there are also versions of it that are designed to run subsonic and suppressed. You can see the extended barrel and the additional suppressor and stuff to this pistol that have been done. So there's a lot more modification to this, whereas the M6 is a fairly standard pistol that is just designed to be high caliber, high stopping power, and relatively accurate with an integrated sight. The next one is the 12mm Comet. It's essentially the SA, but magnumed up. So it's as if you took this SA series pistol and you rechambered it for 12mm like the M6 series Magnum. So it's almost like a crossover there. We see the Comet a lot less because it probably has some feed issues, if I was going to be honest. Having a smaller personal defense weapon chambered up to something like 50 short is going to cause some problems, definitely with recoil. Oh my god, the recoil on the Comet is probably significant. The M4D, it is another 50 short one, possibly a predecessor of the M6, possibly another variant like the 12mm Comet, but it's going to be using that kind of slow but very, very fat 50 short round. 50 AE has some decent velocity to it, but 50 short, which is a caliber that is kind of unique, it doesn't really exist in our modern day as often. It will have a lower velocity, but will have a lot more weight than 44. The next one up is the MK50 Sidekick. The Sidekick is essentially the Glock of the Halo world. It is a polymer frame pistol with a low caliber, probably 9mm or 45 ACP round. It could use 44 short, but I don't think that's the case. It might even use 10 mil. But the 50 Sidekick is kind of a generic pistol. Definitely something that I would imagine would come about after the Human Covenant War, and that seems to be the indication, or very late in the Human Covenant War, because it doesn't really act as an improvement over any of these other options. Certainly is an improvement over the M6 or the SA, and you could argue that it's better than the M4D or the 12mm Comet, but honestly, if I were to pick between the three of them, I would take the M4D. The next ones are our submachine guns. The M7 uses 5mm caseless ammunition. Pretty solid chance that you're going to get these in subsonic ammunition. We see that in Halo 3 ODST that they are using subsonic ammo. And also that they are 5mm rounds. Now, this is going to be like FN57, just a little bit shorter, so you're not going to get as much velocity out of the M7 as you would out of other guns, but it's going to be quiet, especially if you're using subsonic ammo. It's going to be whisper quiet, and it's going to be very, very high rate of fire, and since it uses a side-on stick mag, it actually has a massive ammunition capacity, so like the ODSTs use it, it's a very light personal defense weapon that has high velocity, or relatively high velocity. It's not a pistol caliber, and a very low cross section, so it can probably penetrate a little bit of armor. Again, Covenant body armor, not really, but something like soft flak armor, 5mm caseless might be able to do it. The subsonic rounds will be traveling slower though. So if you want to use them, use the ones from Halo 3 that don't have a suppressor and are clearly using unsuppressed ammunition because they're loud as hell. The M20 PDW is really a pistol built up to be a submachine gun. You can see that unlike the M7, it doesn't have a side magazine, it has a buttstock magazine, or rather a standard pistol arrangement magazine, but it's been modified into a submachine gun. Now, this is from Halo 5. Do I love this weapon? Definitely not. I honestly prefer the M7 because it has a longer barrel, more effective ergonomics, especially with how tight your hands have to be on the M20. I would imagine that Spartans would definitely feel uncomfortable with that kind of flexible, flimsy front post or front grip. However, it is pistol sized, and even though you can't dual wield anymore, this would be a perfect weapon for it. It's essentially an Uzi with slightly less ammunition capacity and a slightly smaller caliber. It probably uses 5mm caseless, to be honest, though it could use something like the smaller rounds that the Sidekick uses, and theoretically it could use 10mm, but I don't think, given the very, very low kick that it has, that it's using 10mm. I think it probably is firing 5mm caseless. It's relatively accurate as well. The M7 has some accuracy problems, but honestly, for the size that it is, that's not surprising. But the M20 is very, very accurate. Weirdly accurate, honestly. So, moving on to standard rifles. We have the MA series. These are really very modular, stripped down 10mm ARs. You can see them up here. They're heavily modified and modifiable. They're made out of essentially just pressed sheet steel in most cases, so they're kept relatively cheap, relatively short barrel. This is what's issued to a lot of the soldiers before the Human Covenant War, and before the MA5 series becomes kind of universal. For example, it's on Contact Harvest in some cases. But these really are a little bit odd because they're 10mm, because they're using the same type of ammunition as some of the like pistol cartridges. It is traveling at a high speed, but it isn't really full rifle caliber. I would say that this is a lot more accurate to something like the VK-78 Commando that's using kind of a not a pistol caliber carbine cartridge, but a pistol caliber out of a rifle platform, essentially. So, not a submachine gun, because it's definitely using a slightly longer 10mm round, but that 10mm round is not a superior round to 7.62 by 51, and that's why the MA series did not see as much use as the MA5. So let's get to the MA5, kind of the one that came after the MA. The MA5 is the angry bongo gun. It's kind of the most classic, very high rate of fire, high cyclic rate, high quality as well with layouts and electronics, a very long barrel, 6 inches longer than the MA series. An integrated light, various integrated electronics, and a new caliber, and also new types of magazines. We have the 32 round and the 60 round. The 60 round isn't as common because, well, it's a lot heavier, and you would probably spend a long time loading them, but it is using a pretty unique round, a 7.62 by 51. Now, that's only a little bit shorter than something used in the Mosin Nagant, so it's traveling pretty darn fast. The MA5 is a massive upgrade over the MA, not only in the facts of ergonomics and, at the sacrifice of being a little bit harder to produce, it is just objectively a better, easier to use gun. And this increase in its velocity is going to give it massive boons because it will dramatically increase its accuracy. And because it often has electrical targeting, unlike the MA series, it will be able to make best use of that higher velocity by targeting enemies that are further away and peppering them with a lot of fire. The HMG-38 Monitor. Now, this is a modernized mobile heavy machine gun. It's referred to as a heavy machine gun, even though in reality I think this is probably something around a 12 or 13mm machine gun. Now, that's heavy. Those are big, thick rounds, and it's clearly coming out of a rifle-length barrel here, but I really wouldn't call this a heavy machine gun. Heavy assault rifle? Oh yeah, for sure. Definitely heavy assault rifle. Heavy machine gun? I don't know. I don't know if it counts as that, mostly because of the ammo limitations. I mean, you can clearly see it's just got a box stick mag, and even if that is double stacked ammunition, it probably doesn't have more than 40 rounds. Especially if it's anything of a higher caliber than like 12. you'd be cutting down the rounds to 15 or 20. And if you're only getting 20 rounds of high caliber ammunition out of a fully automatic weapon, is it really a machine gun? I think you've just accidentally made a high caliber, rifle by accident. So yeah, the HMG monitor is a little bit of an odd one. It's used by the insurrection in a lot of cases, but it's also used by planetary defense forces, equivalent in the Halo universe. Speaking of weird guns, the VK-78 Commando. It's a 6.5 by 48 carbine rifle with 20 round mags. Now, this is down here. It's a very long barrel. It's almost like the original DMR or the marksman rifle, but it's using a smaller and slightly slower cartridge, so it really is more accurate to say that it's like an M1 carbine to the marksman rifle's M1 Garand. So, a little bit slower, a little bit smaller caliber, but also weirdly small mags. It essentially is like a cross between the MA5 and the marksman rifle. So I could see this having a lot of uses. Definitely in the semi-automatic mode, you're going to want to save the 20 rounds that you have in that magazine, especially given its kind of lower penetration rate. So yeah, it doesn't really even look all that much more modular than something like an MA5B. So I think this one is going to see a lot less play, and I think that's borne out in a lot of the lore. The next one up is the battle rifle. Now, Sergeant Avery Johnson here is showing us a lovely image of the original battle rifle. But this is an burst fire or select fire extended AR. It is essentially an MA5, but it's been given a significant increase to its barrel length in order to increase accuracy, and it's also been given a nice consistent fire rate and a built-in high zoom scope. Now, there are variants of this that come later with higher calibers or faster fire rates or slower fire rates or more select fire, but the original was literally just an MA5 designed to be a designated marksman weapon before the marksman rifle existed, and it fired, of course, the same exact ammunition as the MA5 as far as I know. The marksman rifle is using the same ammunition as the MA5, so what makes it special? It fires specialty ammunition at default. That default ammunition is specifically high pressure armor piercing ammo. So it's essentially firing 7.62 by 51, but high armor piercing ammunition on a semi-automatic platform with the same accuracy upgrades as the battle rifle. Longer range with a longer barrel and a very nice scope. So this is the DMR marksman rifle that you see in the later Halo games. The sniper rifle is the next one, and the SLA is a crazy rifle. It is a 14.5 by 114 millimeter anti-materiel rifle using pretty much unique special ammunition. Now, there are a couple of versions of this, but the ones that I love the absolute best are the high velocity armor piercing rounds that are essentially built like armor piercing discarding sabot rounds out of this massive anti-materiel sniper rifle. This is one of the most damaging guns that you can get your hands on in Halo. Honestly, in, real life metrics, this thing is an anti-materiel rifle that would destroy most light vehicles, and hell, with the anti-armor weapon, with the anti-armor ammunition that it comes, in some cases standard, but in some cases it can come with, would probably do in a lot of medium Covenant vehicles. For example, the sniper rifle could likely penetrate the canopy of a Banshee without much difficulty. And while it might not do a lot of damage to larger vehicles that have more room for the bullet to miss the crew, in the Banshee you are stuck into it, and if a sniper rifle bullet comes right through there, you're probably going to die. So, very effective weapon, lots of use cases, and of course it has a massive advantage of over-penetration through things like walls. So, support weapons. Lots of options here. But let's start off with the complex ones and go to the more simple ones. The railguns. Now, the Halo railgun is really just a big or a small slug thrower. It's traveling at relatively high speeds, but it isn't super long. It is essentially firing something the size of a shotgun slug at incredibly high speeds, and it really maxes out the kinetic energy impact rather than the armor penetration impact. Don't get me wrong, it can penetrate armor, but don't think of it like a rail rifle from Halo or a rail rifle from 40K or anything like that. It's not on that level. And especially because it's single shot and you have to practically replace the entire upper part of it every time that you shoot, in terms of like the power pack that is. It's pretty limited, and it really is best used against kind of medium armored Covenant infantry, because my favorite thing about the railgun is this high grade anti-armor weapon cannot kill uh, certain Covenant infantry because they're shielded too well. So it works better against vehicles, especially against medium vehicles. And then the laser for the Spartan laser is really just a very powerful single shot laser weapon. So think of it very similar to a las cannon, except it has a charge up, and it needs to kind of cool down after each shot. So a lot of effect on target, very, very damaging to enemy vehicles. But of course, it has that natural limitation of, well, it's man portable, so of course you have to load, aim, and keep it on target with this scintillating red beam until it gives off a long burst of laser energy. The next one up is kind of a mess of weapons, because there are very, very, very many variants of these of many types. Recoilless rifles, missile launchers, and grenade launchers. And this is my favorite one here, the Spanker, the kind of tube rocket that has a kind of odd system for interchanging ammunition. Instead of having a launcher that you put rounds into, you have a launcher and then you have the barrels co-located with the rounds and the propellant that you slap onto the launcher like you're putting a Beyblade onto a spinner. So it's a very interesting system. But the UNSC mix these around a lot, but they all use specialized ammunition, including tracking, heat seekers, delayed explosives, flak rounds, and of course, high explosive and anti-tank. The real advantage of humanity is that we have been working with complex chemical explosives for as long as the Covenant have been working with plasma. Meaning that our recoilless weapons, missile launchers, and grenade launchers are a hell of a lot more advanced than humanity's are, which means that a lot of these are going to be doing very, very well against a lot of different threats. The big downside of that is that there are limitations to missiles and rockets. Now, they can do a lot of damage, don't get me wrong, but even the Spanker is only like a 6 centimeter rocket. It's not massive. They're not going to be carrying the high explosive payload that you would see on something like an RPG, for example. An RPG can have quite a lot of high explosive, and something like an 8 centimeter rocket from an aircraft will also do more damage. But, big but, we have a lot of these, and we can arm our basic infantry with a missile launcher and make them lethal against enemy tanks. The Covenant can't do that as easily. They don't have a lot of designate anti-tank weapons that have the range and capability of our explosive weapons. The next one up is another big advantage for humanity. Machine guns. High caliber, long range, fully sustained, and, a weird thing, fixed heavy machine guns with tri-rotary barrels. Now, tri-rotary barrels are an odd thing. We have saw caliber machine guns as well, kind of that 7.62 fully automatic drum machine guns, the classic saw, but humanity in the UNSC tends to prefer these tri-rotary barrels, high caliber 13 to 15 millimeter machine guns, I think because of sustained fire. So not only do these have a lot of punch to them, a lot of hit, they're very high damage, some of them are 12.7, but a lot of them are much more than that. They carry this massive kinetic impact, but unlike our single barrel or our rotary barrel machine guns of today, tri-rotary barrels can be a lot thicker and a lot heavier, and while they restrict the speed of the machine gun's fire, it does mean that they can continue sustained fire for longer. And for humanity that has to be dealing with lots of different enemies, enemies with shields, enemies who have different toughness levels, let's say, they want to have sustained fire on them. That's not to say that that's the reason why these were developed. Obviously, they existed before that, but the reason why they persisted and were not replaced was because of this idea of persistent heavy fire being better than extremely high rate of fire rounds from something like a minigun, or slower high caliber rounds from something like an autocannon. So the medium and heavy fixed machine guns of humanity, of the UNSC, kind of struck a very nice middle ground that has remained effective throughout the entire Human Covenant War. Shotguns are very simple. They're just pump action. Most of them use 12 gauge. They're quite effective against lots of different targets. And of course, very similar variety of rounds exist. Generally in the games, we see them using buckshot. Though there are some examples, like you could argue that the Reach and the Combat Evolved version were using Birdshot or Bucket Ball. Could be something that they were using similar to that because they have a much larger spread and spray, and they also shoot out a lot of smoke. Could be an indication of lots of moving targets, but that's just a theory. The last one is flame weapons. Flame weapons are really an abnormal use by humanity. It's not common, and they're usually restricted to a mix of chemical defoliants and flame. So you will get traditional fire flamethrowers, but you also get chemical defoliant projectors. And most often, these would be used on, regular enemies, but of course they found their niche against the Flood because fire destroys the Flood supercell, and it can be very effective against them. So, flame weapons kind of would probably come into demand if the Flood had been more of an issue during the Human Covenant War. But as engagements with the Flood across the entire front were relatively limited, there was not a massive outbreak like there was during the days of the Forerunners. It wasn't that bad, and the flamethrower, apart from the one time in Halo 3, apart from that one time, there wasn't a massive outbreak of the Flood within human covenant warfare interactions. So it wasn't used as much, but they were used sometimes. So this has been another good little video of alternatives. I know the UNSC weapons are quite varied and complex. I didn't go into them in as much detail. Perhaps in future I will. And certainly when comparing weapons across fictions, you can see some of my inherent both lack of knowledge and biases come out. But I do like to do these just as kind of a reference for people, and so I can share some nice little lore tidbits and get to know what people want to see, what they want to talk about. But either way, this has been a long one. Not a long video, but a long evening, recording double, and I wish you all a lovely good night.